Hello boys and girls, we're on to the next part of chapter 4 of Oliver and the Seawigs. And more to the point, what about my nest? Demanded Mr. Culpepper, circling above Oliver's head. I know, said Oliver. He scrambled back onto the cliff's beach and quickly gathered anything that looked as if it might float away, including the albatross's nest. He dumped it all in the dinghy and then climbed in it with it. Then, whilst Iris swam about below directing things, she wasn't much help because her eyesight was even worse underwater than it was above, but she liked to feel important. Cliff knelt down on his gigantic underwater knees and let the waves of the sarcastic sea swirl over his head. Oliver put on his goggles again and hung over the edge of his dinghy, with his face in the sea as the waters lifted it. Down in the green gloom far below he saw Cliff carefully edge his way towards the wreck and glimpsed the flash of Iris's rainbow tail as she circled, gesturing at Cliff to move left a bit, right a bit, stop, come forward. She didn't realise that she had her back to Cliff. She was actually gesturing a confused-looking whale which just happened to be passing. And there you can see all the commotion going on. Cliff went right up to the wreck. He nudged it with his head and tugged at it with his stumpy, stony arms. At last it shifted and rolled gently sidewards. Oliver jumped up. That's it, he hooted, although Oliver knew the rambling island couldn't hear him. You've done it! Now come up! Cliff settled the weight of the ancient submarine on his head and began to rise, carefully, with the swirls of sand glittering in the sea around him. He came up under the dinghy in a great roaring and rushing and bubbling of water, and a flopping and floundering of stranded fishes. Most of them were washed back into the sea as Cliff continued to raise and the water poured off him. Soon there was beach beneath Oliver's dinghy again. On the top of Cliff's head lay the water mole, all wet and starkling and shining in the sunlight. The striped eel had slivered off, and the glided bowsprit glimmered faintly, pointing at the sky. It was the finest wig an island ever wore. Yay! Shouted Oliver, jumping out of the dinghy and doing a victory dance among the rock pools. Yay! Said Iris, flopping ashore and wringing out her hair. Yay! Rumbled Clay. And yay! Clawed Mr. Culpepper. Only the sarcastic strands of floating weed were unimpressed. Showy, they complained, still keeping a distance from Cliff shores. Shipwrecks are so last season, they went on. Only seaweed, so who cared what they thought? Then Mr. Culpepper, gliding down to perch on the coral-encrusted flagstaff, said suddenly, What's that? Oliver turned to look. There behind them on the weedy sea, an island stood. He could not believe that he hadn't noticed it before. And there you can see the Seawig with the shipwreck, well, the ship's submarine on his head. Mr. Culpepper. There's Oliver, and there's Iris. It was not really an island, of course. It was another rambling island, and it had crept out of a nearby fog bank and sneaked up behind Cliff while everyone was distracted by the raising of the submarine. Although Oliver did not recognise it, it was one of the same islands which had been resting in Deepwater Bay the day his parents disappeared. He'd not been able to see it from his bedroom window. There you can see it there, look. Because of the headland hid it, but Mr. and Mr. Crisp had seen it as they motored away from the beach in their dinghy, and had steered straight towards it because they could tell at once that it was easily the most interesting. It was tall and rocky, and on its summit dark trees clustered. Amongst the trees stood a ruined temple, crumbly and overgrown. Around the temple towered huge stone heads with empty eyes and open-mouthed. They looked a bit like the famous statues on Easter Island. In fact, they were, where the Easter Islands had got their idea from. For this rambling island had passed close to Easter Island long ago. Remarkable, Oliver's dad had shouted as the dinghy bounced across the waves of Deepwater Bay. Pre-Columbian, a whole new civilization, declared Oliver's mum, snapping photos of the weird stone heads as the dinghy swept into the island's shadow and circled it, searching for a place to land. There was a beach on the seaward side, a beach of black sand with steps carved in the cliff behind it, winding up past crumbled walls and watchful statues to those intriguing ruins on the summit. Poor foolish crisps! They were so eager to explore they did not bother dragging their dinghy up above the tide line, which everyone knows is one of the first rules of exploring. They just left it there upon the shining sand and ran up those stairs. The clicking of their cameras echoed amongst the ruins, and so did their excited cries until they reached the ruined temple. It was not quite as ruined as it had looked from sea level. Someone had put double glazing in its windows, and a chimney poked from the roof, puffing out little circles of wood smoke. "Oh, this island is inhabited," said Oliver's dad, trying not to sound too disappointed, even though he had hoped to be the first person to discover a lost civilization. "But who inhabited by whom?" asked his wife, imagining lost tribes, priest kings and ancient wisdom. That was when the island shivered. That's when it shook. "Earthquake!" cried Mrs. Crisp. "Volcano!" yelled her husband. The island sank a little, down on its shore. Waves swirled up the beach, lifted the abandoned dinghy and carried it gently out into the bay. And from the open mouths of all those stone heads came a noise, a rustling, a whispering, a scrambling, a jostling, a strange demented jabbering that grew louder and louder as the island started moving out to sea. And now here it stood, a few hundred yards from Cliff, with Oliver staring at it in surprise. "Look at all those creepy old heads," said Iris. Cliff turned beneath them, looking. "Oh dear," he rumbled. "Oh no, it's the Furlstone." "What's the Furlstone?" asked Oliver. "It's a very old and very bad," Cliff said. "Bad men did human sacrifices in that temple on its top long ago, and the blood trickled down inside and turned it wicked. They say it's quite hollow and rotten to the core. Oh dear." The Furlstone lifted itself a little way out of the water. Massive weedy shoulders rose into the sunlight. Water drained out through cracks and of the island's sides. Its mean black eyes stared hard at Cliff through veils of falling water. A mouth like a sea cave opened, and a stony voice said, "Nice shipwreck you have there." "It's ours," Iris shouted back. "We found it." His voice sounded very small and thin and shrill after thunder of the Furlstones. It boomed again. "Don't like the mermaid, though," it said. "Mermaids are vulgar." Now that he came to look properly at it, Oliver saw that the Furlstone was wearing quite an elaborate sea wig. Loads of plaited seaweed were arranged around. There you can see, there they are, and there's the new sea wig. Its cliffs glittering with bits of broken glass and shiny metal. Old flip-flops dangled from the branches of those dark and twisted trees, and amongst the rocks where the temple stood, a trailer and a rusty battleship were perched. From the cliffs on either side of its face, two big glass globes dangled in cradles of knotted rope like earrings or baubles on a Christmas tree. Inside the globes something moved. Oliver snatched his rucksack and ferreted inside it for his binoculars. He focused on one of the glassy danglers. The thing inside it was his mum. He yelped and swung the binoculars. There inside the other globe was his dad. The explorer seemed quite unharmed. Oliver began to jump up and down on the beach. He waved and shouted. When he looked through the binoculars again, he saw his mum had spotted him. He saw his dad scribble something in his explorer's notebook and press it flat against the inside of his glass prison for Oliver. It read, "Help." His mother was scribbling too and pressing a note of her own to the glass, but the Furlstone was coming closer. Ignoring mean comments and backhanded compliments from the floating ween, it shouldered its way through the sea. There you can see his mum and dad. His dad's written help. His mum's written stay away. Octopuses withered their tentacles among their eyebrows, and a shark fell out of its nose like a fierce bogey. Up on its forehead a little platform had been built, and there a boy stood looking down. The Furlstone was so close by then that Oliver didn't need his binoculars anymore. He could see the boy quite clearly without them. He was older than Oliver, a tall teenager, balancing precautiously on bean-sprout legs and about to tumble clumsily into adulthood. He wore sea boots and a sailor's uniform with all sorts of gold braid and medals and fancy finery all over it. When the gap of open water between cliff and furlstone had narrowed to the stone's throw, the furlstone stopped in a swirl of foam and spoke again. "Want it?" he said, staring at the water mole. Up upon its brow the boy picked up a big brass megaphone and bellowed through it. "My island wants that wreck of yours. You'd better hand it over." Oh, the cheek, squealed Iris. "We found it. It's ours." "You're not having my wig," rumbled Cliff. Oliver just cupped his mouth around his mouth and shouted, "Give me back my mum and dad." The other boy threw back his head and laughed. "Ha ha ha ha!" It was the sort of laugh that told you instantly he was not about to let poor Mr. and Mrs. Chris go. "Ha ha ha ha!" he cackled. "So they are yours, are they? Well, you should have taken better care of them. They make nice additions to the Furlstone Seawig, don't you think? But not as nice as that fine submarine your island's found. Hand it over now, and spare yourself a lot of unpleasantness." There he is shouting. "Who are you anyway?" asked Iris. "Oh, you're full of yourself." "My name," said the boy importantly, "is Stacey de Lacy." "But that's a girl's name," blurted Oliver. Stacey de Lacy's face turned a dark shade of red. "Silence!" he shouted. "Stacey is one of those names that can be a boy or a girl, like Hilary or Leslie or Anyway, what's the night of the Seawig rolls around, my Furlstone shall have the finest wig of all. That submarine is just the thing we need to top it off, and we won't give it. If you won't give it us, we shall take it anyway." "Mad!" Iris said undertone. "Quite mad!" Stacey de Lacy clapped his hands. "Come, my lovelies," he shouted and laughed with wicked glee. "Ha ha ha!" From the giant statue, which grinned and gurned upon the Furlstone's head, there came a rustling, a whispering, a scrambling, a jostling, a strange, demented jabbering. What could it be? Let's just see how much of this chapter's left. Shall we read on for a little bit? No wonder Stacey de Lacy sounded gleeful. It was quite a new feeling for him. Giving orders. When he'd been growing up, nobody had ever taken much notice of him. His parents, who were rich and busy, barely paid him any attention. The other children at school all hated him. And why did they hate him? Well, actually it was because he was a nasty, boastful bully. But Stacey didn't realise that. He was sure it's because of his name. Stacey can be a boy's name too, he would tell them when they laughed at him. They never believed him. Angry and all alone, he took long walks on the beach near his house, dreaming of the terrible revenge he would take on them all when he was older. All sorts of things washed up on that beach. As Stacey de Lacy strode along with his hands in his pockets, he was forever kicking aside old flip-flops, fishermen's floats and plastic bottles with mysterious foreign labels. One day after a storm, he found the shingle covered with stinking seaweed, uprooted from some deep hollow of the seabed. It was a type of seaweed that had never noticed before. It had thick stalks, each as tall as Stacey, with a fat green bulb at the top. Stacey picked up one of the stalks and began cracking it like a bullwhip as he stomped along. He imagined lashing his classmates with it. "Stacey's not a girl's name," he shouted. "Crack! You better know that when I'm famous and powerful," he yelled. "Crack! Just you wait," he hollowed. "One day I'll crack, squelch, splat." The green bulb at the end of the sea whip burst, and out came a spurt of dirty water and something else, something that moved, scrabbling and burrowing its way into the tangles of dead weed that were heaped along the tide line. Stacey went closer and prodded the weed piles with his toes. Something was definitely rustling around in there. He bent down for a closer look. Suddenly the weed was torn aside, with a hideous little fangled and grinning face stared up at him. Then two little web-fingered hands seized the toe of his sneaker, and the creature sank its teeth into the rubber. "Yow!" shouted Stacey de Lacy, doing a triple backward somersault in his surprise. The creature flew off his shoe, By the time he had clambered up and dusted the sand out of his eyes, it was crouching on a nearby rock, watching him. It looked like an ugly little monkey with webbed hands and feet and greasy green fur. "Get lost!" he yelled angrily. The sea monkey cowered and crept away over the top of the rock out of sight. Stacy was impressed. He wasn't used to people doing what he told them. "Come back!" he shouted. The monkey reappeared. "My name is Stacy DeLacy," he said, and watched the monkey suspiciously. It didn't laugh. It didn't even giggle. "Stacy is not a girl's name," he said. Still nothing. Feeling encouraged, he told it, "You're mine. You will do everything I say." The monkey grew itself to attention and saluted. If Stacy DeLacy had been a different sort of boy, he might have thought, "I've found a friend." But Stacy had never really wanted friends. He thought, "I found a servant." Now you can see the little funny-looking monkey there. He looked around. All about him the beach was littered with whips of the strange weed, each with its sea green bulb. Was there a monkey in each one? There must be loads of them, hundreds. He picked up a strand and squeezed the bulb till it popped like a spot. Out tumbled another monkey. Excitedly, he popped another and another. "Help me," he ordered the chittering, jittering monkeys, and they ran with him. Along the tide line, squeezing and popping, until a whole army of sea monkeys were scuttling behind him. Oh, they look really cute. Stacy DeLacy knew that his parents would never let him keep anything as stinking repulsive looking as these monkeys. Luckily, there was a particularly large and slimy rock pool that he knew of around the curve of the cliffs, where nobody but he ever went. He led the monkeys there and watched them pour into the pool. They were as happy under the water as above it. They crouched in the shadows of the pool and looked up at Stacy with wicked, weary eyes. "I am your master," he said proudly. After that, Stacy DeLacy turned his thoughts to the sea. If sea monkeys were real, then what other creatures might be in the oceans? Between trips to the rock pool, where he fed and gloated over his growing monkey band, he talked to the sailors about the harbour. He peered at old books in secret libraries. He learned of the Hallow Shallows. He learned of mermaids and drowned cities. He learned of the Rambling Islands and the gathering that held on the night of the Seawigs. "Monkeys are all very well," said Stacy DeLacy to himself, "but I have my own Rambling Island. Think how powerful I'd be then." He liked the idea of roving the world on his own island, being mean to people. So he started scouring the beach for interesting things the sea washed up, and leaving them above the tide line on a tall rock just offshore. If the night of the Seawigs was real, he thought, no Rambling Island would resist such top-notch wig ingredients, and sure enough, one foggy evening, he heard great sloshing footsteps move through the waves towards that rock, and saw a giant shape moving in the mist. He heard the Rambling Island grumbling to itself as it shifted through the pile of driftwood and old fishing nets he'd left. "This stuff's no good," he heard it say. "It won't help win." "Hey, Island!" shouted Stacy DeLacy. The grumbling stopped. The thing in the fog stood listening. "You want to win that stupid Seawigs thing?" yelled Stacy. "You should steal the best stuff from other islands' wigs, and if you can't then just nobble them, ruin their wigs so they can't win." As luck would have it, the island Stacy was talking to was none other than the old Thurlestone, the meanest of all the Rambling Islands. The Thurlestone liked the way the boy fought. "How?" he asked. "Help, with my help," said Stacy, and as the Thurlestone loomed out of the fog to peer down at him, he spread his arms out proudly to show it to the gibbering, jabbering swarm of monkeys crowded on the shingle behind him. "I have an army of monkeys," he said. That's what the green tide was pouring out of the mouths and eyes of the Thurlstone's old head and rushing across the sea. Sea monkeys, small and smelly in their coats of greasy green fur, they giggled horribly as they swam towards cliff or scrambled across the mats of drifting weed. "Don't mind us," grumbled wet weed mats, but the sea monkeys were immune to sarcasm. Up Cliff's beaches they rushed, knocking poor Iris off her rock. And there they all are, look. You could have a go at drawing a little sea monkey, look. They look quite easy to draw. with a circle face and a body and a curly tail. Have a go and post your picture. Let's see how much there's left. Oh, one more page till chapter 6. They sank their teeth and claws into the orange inflatable and popped it just for laughs. Oliver tried to stop them. He picked up monkeys and hurled them back at the sea, but more than landing all the time, and they were scary and dangerous looking. They bared their dirty yellow fangs and screeched at him. The monkey tide sloshed up onto the cliff's bouldery summit and lapped around the water mole. The sea monkeys were so small that Oliver did not think they could shift the submarine, but there were so many of them that they did. The water mole lifted from its perch afloat again on a sea of snot green fur. Oliver and Iris had to jump out of the way as the chattering monkeys rushed back with it into the sea. The furlstone dipped down till only Stacey's balcony and the old stones and the trees around the temple showed, and the monkeys swam and swirled and shrugged and shoved the water mole onto its head. "So long, losers," called Stacey de Lacy, waving. "We'll see you at the hallowed shallows, if you still think's worth turning up, of course." The furlstone turned and moved off. The glass orbs, which were Oliver's parents' prisons, bobbed on either side of it, towed on their tivers of rope, with Mr. and Mrs. Cribb waving sad goodbyes inside them. Sea monkeys went on scurrying back to the nests and the old stone heads. The water mole shone so brightly in the slanting sea light that Oliver could see the gleam of it long after the wicked island had dwindled to a speck on the horizon. "That went well," said the watching weed. And now we're on to chapter 6, where there's nothing left on the wandering island. What they're going to do to try and get that back and save the day and save his parents, you will find out tomorrow. Bye for now, boys and girls.